The wagon creaked and lurched as it climbed the narrow mountain road. Sarah sat rigid on the wooden seat, her gloved hands clutching a small leather bag against her chest. Her black dress felt heavy, soaked through at the hem from the morning mist that clung to everything like a second skin. She had left the village before dawn, her veil pulled low over her pale face. The driver hadn't spoken a word during the long ascent, and she hadn't dared to ask where exactly they were going. All she knew was the letter, that thin slip of paper, written in a shaky hand, telling her she had kin in the mountains who would take her in after her husband's sudden death. When the wagon finally stopped, Sarah looked up. The house in front of her seemed to rise straight out of the fog, a tall, narrow structure made of dark timber, its roof sagging under the weight of age and damp. No lantern glowed in the windows, no warmth spilled from the doorway. The driver gave her a quick sideways glance, then turned the horse without a word. The wheels rattled away, fading into the gray veil of the mountain trail. Sarah stood alone now. She took one hesitant step onto the muddy yard, her boots sinking with a wet sigh. The house loomed closer, its walls streaked with moss, its shutters warped and crooked. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. A cold wind drifted down the path behind her, curling around her ankles like a warning. The front door creaked open. A man stood there, tall and thin, his dark coat buttoned up to his throat. His hair was long and slicked back, revealing a pale, severe face marked by deep lines and a thin scar across his jaw. "Sarah," he said, his voice deep and flat, like a church bell muffled in snow. She tried to answer, but her voice stuck in her throat. She managed a small nod instead. "Come inside," he said, stepping back into the dark hallway. Sarah hesitated on the threshold. The air inside felt even colder than the mountain wind. She stepped forward slowly, her boots leaving wet prints on the uneven wooden floor. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud. She flinched at the sound, her heart thudding in her ears. The hallway stretched narrow and dim, lined with faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her as she moved. A faint smell of damp wood and something sour hung in the air. The man, Thomas, she remembered from the letter, took her bag from her hands without asking and placed it at the foot of the stairs. "You will stay upstairs," he said. "Third door on the right. Supper is at dusk. You do not wander, you do not go outside after dark." Sarah nodded again, her lips dry and cracked. Thomas stared at her a moment longer, as if measuring something inside her. Then he turned and disappeared down a side hallway, his footsteps echoing like distant hammer strikes. Sarah stood alone, her breath curling in the cold air. She looked up the staircase, each step shrouded in shadow. Slowly, she climbed, her hand brushing the rough rail. The stairs creaked under her weight, each sound sharp as a snapped twig. At the top, the hallway was darker still. She found the third door and pushed it open with a trembling hand. The room inside was small and plain. A narrow bed sat beneath a tiny window, its frame warped and spotted with mold. A single wooden chair leaned against the far wall, and a chipped basin stood in the corner. She closed the door softly behind her and crossed to the window. The fog outside pressed against the glass like a living thing, erasing any hint of path or road. Sarah pressed her forehead to the cold pane. Somewhere below she heard Thomas moving through the house. The clink of metal, the scrape of a chair, the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who owned every inch of this place. She felt a sharp pang in her chest, a sense that she had stepped into a trap woven from silence and shadows. She turned from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting limp in her lap. A single thought repeated in her mind, echoing louder with each beat of her heart. "I should have never come here." Sarah woke to the creak of heavy footsteps below her room. The air felt sharp and damp, her breath rising in small, quick clouds. She sat up slowly, the stiff mattress creaking beneath her. Through the thin walls, she heard the muffled clang of metal and the low scrape of a chair on the wooden floor. Thomas was already moving through the house, each sound a reminder of his presence, steady, controlled, watchful. She dressed quickly, pulling the black dress over her cold skin. Her fingers trembled as she pinned her hair beneath the veil. She paused at the window, but the glass was nearly opaque with mist. The yard and path beyond were swallowed by the same heavy fog that had carried her here. A soft knock broke her focus. She turned sharply. The door swung open without waiting for her reply. Thomas stood in the hallway, his figure tall and angular in the pale morning light. His dark coat was already buttoned, his hair combed flat against his head. "Breakfast," he said, his voice low and final. Sarah followed him down the narrow stairs, her hand skimming the rail for balance. The hallway felt even darker now, the portraits on the walls looming like silent witnesses. In the kitchen, a plain wooden table stood set with a small pot of porridge, a single loaf of bread, and 2 chipped bowls. The room smelled of smoke and something bitter that she couldn't place. Thomas sat first, gesturing for her to join. She lowered herself onto the chair, careful not to let her skirt brush the floor. They ate in silence, the scrape of the spoon against the bowl, the slow tear of bread. Each sound seemed to echo louder than any words. Halfway through the meal, Thomas looked up. His eyes were flat and pale, like winter water. "You do not leave the yard," he said. "You do not speak to any visitors, should any come. You do not enter the cellar or the back rooms. At night, you remain in your room and keep quiet." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry as ash. She nodded, lowering her eyes to her bowl. "If you follow the rules," Thomas continued, "things will remain peaceful." She forced another nod, the spoon trembling in her hand. The word peaceful rang in her ears like a threat dressed as kindness. After breakfast, Thomas stood abruptly and carried his bowl to a basin in the corner. He washed it quickly, each movement controlled and sharp. "You will help Agnes today," he said without turning. "She will show you your tasks." Sarah rose as he stepped past her. For a brief moment, his coat brushed her sleeve. The contact felt cold, like the flick of a blade. When he was gone, she stood in the kitchen, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. A few minutes later, a woman shuffled in from a side door. She was small and bent, her hair a dull gray tied back in a loose knot. Her eyes, sunken and pale, flicked over Sarah without warmth or curiosity. "Follow me," Agnes muttered, her voice low and rasping from years of smoke and silence. Sarah obeyed, trailing her into a side hallway lined with cracked floor tiles and damp walls. Agnes moved slowly, as if each step hurt. She led Sarah into a small pantry stacked with jars of cloudy preserves and sacks of dry beans. "You sort," Agnes said simply, pointing to a pile of shriveled vegetables and old cloth sacks. Sarah knelt and began working, her fingers cold and clumsy at first. Agnes watched for a while, then turned and left without another word. In the cramped room, Sarah felt the house settle around her. Every floorboard groaning, every wall breathing. She listened carefully, her ears catching distant creaks and the echo of footsteps in rooms she wasn't allowed to see. Sometimes a door closed far away, and she would freeze, her heart hammering in her throat. Hours passed like slow drops of water. By the time Agnes returned, Sarah's back ached, her knees numb. Agnes said nothing. She simply gestured for her to follow back to the kitchen. There, Thomas stood waiting, his hands resting flat on the table. His eyes swept over her, pausing on the dirt under her fingernails and the crease in her dress. "You will keep to your duties," he said, his voice measured and final. "And you will not forget the rules." Sarah nodded, staring at a knot in the wooden floor rather than his face. Thomas stepped past her again, his presence thick and cold. Agnes lingered by the stove, her eyes on the pot she stirred, as though she hadn't heard a thing. Sarah felt the walls tighten around her, the rules sinking into her skin like hooks. As she climbed the stairs to her room that evening, she held the rail tighter, each step a careful, measured act of obedience. In her room, she sat on the bed, her hands resting limp in her lap. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, silent and unyielding. Inside, her heart thudded slowly, echoing one thought over and over. I am trapped. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the low rumble of voices outside her door. She sat up quickly, her hands gripping the thin blanket. Through the gap beneath the door, she saw two sets of shadows moving, Thomas's slow, deliberate stride and another, lighter step she didn't recognize. A moment later, the door swung open. Thomas stood there, his face as unreadable as ever. Behind him, a young man hovered in the hallway, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed. "This is Samuel," Thomas said curtly. "He works the grounds. You do not speak to him unless instructed." Sarah's gaze shifted to Samuel. He looked young, barely more than a boy, his hair shaggy and dark, his clothes patched and stained with earth. His eyes darted up for a second, meeting hers. They were wide and bright, full of something Sarah couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or something deeper, something that flickered like a candle in a storm. Thomas turned sharply and left without another word. Samuel hesitated for a moment longer, then shuffled away after him, his steps soundless on the wooden floor. Sarah sat frozen, her breath caught halfway in her chest. That brief glance from Samuel had cut through the coldness of the house, but it also unsettled her, reminding her of how alone she truly was. A while later, Agnes entered without knocking, carrying a small basket filled with onions and turnips. She set it on the chair by the window, her eyes sliding over Sarah without stopping. "You prepare these for supper," Agnes said, her voice flat as a cracked dish. "Peel and sort, quietly." Sarah nodded and moved to the chair, her fingers trembling as she reached for the first onion. Agnes lingered by the doorway, her hands twisting a rag. For a moment she opened her mouth as if to say something, but then she closed it, her lips pressing into a thin, pale line. She turned and left, the door clicking shut behind her. Sarah worked in silence. The knife felt heavy in her hand, each cut releasing a sharp sting that filled her eyes with tears. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her movements, the scrape of the blade, the hollow sound of peels hitting the basin. But her mind drifted to Samuel. His eyes, so quick and bright yet hollow, haunted her. In this house of locked rooms and closed mouths, he seemed like the only other soul aware of the bars around them. As the morning wore on, the wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes. Once or twice, Sarah thought she heard footsteps in the hallway, stopping near her door, then moving away. Each time, her fingers froze, her breath shallow and tight in her chest. By midday, her hands were red and raw, the basin nearly full. She set down the knife and flexed her fingers, staring at the pale, veined skin as if it belonged to someone else. A sudden noise snapped her attention to the window, the brief shape of a figure moving past in the yard below. She pressed her face to the glass, wiping away the fog with her sleeve. Samuel stood by the woodpile, splitting logs. His movements were quick but careful, each swing of the axe controlled. Even from above, she could see the tightness in his shoulders, the way he glanced toward the house between strikes. She watched him for a long moment, her breath fogging the glass again. There was something about his presence, a silent message she couldn't quite decipher. Then, abruptly, he stopped. He turned, lifting his head as if he felt her gaze. Their eyes met through the blurred pane. A flicker, almost like a plea, passed across his face before he dropped his head and turned back to his work. Sarah stepped away from the window, her heart pounding so loud she felt it in her fingertips. She pressed her palms to her face, her thoughts tumbling over each other like stones in a fast river. When she finally lowered her hands, she realized the room felt smaller than before. The walls pressed closer, the shadows deepened. She crossed to the bed and sat on the edge, her skirt bunching around her knees. The knife lay on the chair, gleaming dully in the gray light. A single word pulsed in her mind, rising through the fog of fear and rules. Escape. She didn't know when or how, but in that moment she understood she was not the only one waiting for a door to open. That night Sarah lay awake on her narrow bed, the blanket pulled up to her chin, though it offered little warmth. The wind moaned against the old house, slipping through cracks in the wooden walls and rattling the warped window frame. She stared at the ceiling, tracing the twisting shadows left by the moonlight. Every creak of the floorboards below set her teeth on edge, each distant thud of footsteps sending sharp jolts through her chest. At some point, she heard the slow, steady steps of Thomas moving down the hallway. She held her breath as they paused outside her door. The faintest click followed, the sound of a hand testing the latch. Her heart pounded so hard she felt it in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to appear asleep. The handle moved slightly, then stilled. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps continued down the hall, fading into the deep hush of the house. She waited, counting silently to 100, her breath trapped in her lungs. When she finally opened her eyes, they burned with exhaustion and terror. Unable to remain still, she sat up and slid off the bed. Her bare feet touched the cold floor, and she winced, but she kept moving. She crept to the window and peered out into the fog-drenched yard. The moon hung low and pale, casting a milky glow over the grass and the old wooden fence. Near the woodpile, she saw movement, a figure shifting in the shadows. She squinted, pressing her forehead to the cold glass. It was Samuel. Even at this hour he worked, moving logs into a pile, his movements slow and deliberate as if to avoid making noise. She watched him, feeling something strange twist inside her chest, a mixture of dread and the faintest glimmer of connection. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound from the hallway. She turned sharply, her breath catching. A floorboard creaked outside her door, followed by silence. She stepped back from the window, her spine pressed against the damp wall. She stood there for a long moment, listening. The silence pressed against her eardrums like water. When no one came, she inched forward again, curiosity and fear warring inside her. She lowered herself to her knees beside the bed and ran her fingers along the warped floorboards. One plank near the corner felt slightly raised. With careful fingers, she pried at it. It shifted under her touch, revealing a narrow cavity beneath. Her hand slipped inside, brushing against something soft. Cloth, maybe, or paper. She pulled out a small bundle wrapped in stained linen. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. Inside lay a few brittle sheets of paper covered in spidery handwriting. By the pale moonlight she strained to read the first lines. "I am writing this in secret. He watches everything. He hears everything. I do not know how long I will last here. My name is Margaret." Sarah's breath snagged in her chest. Her eyes darted to the door, half expecting it to burst open. She continued to read, her eyes devouring each desperate word. Margaret wrote of being brought here, of the strict rules, of the constant surveillance. She wrote of Thomas's punishments, of Agnes's cold compliance, and of Samuel's silence. Sarah's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the pages. The final line struck her like a blow. "If you find this, perhaps you will be braver than I was." A sudden noise in the hallway snapped her head up. She stuffed the papers back into the cavity, pushed the board into place, and scrambled to her feet. She dove into bed, pulling the blanket over her head just as the door handle rattled again. This time it opened slowly. Through the thin weave of the blanket she saw a figure slip into the room. She held her breath, her body rigid with terror. The figure stood still for a moment, then took a slow step forward. Another. The floor creaked under the weight. Then, as quietly as it had entered, the figure retreated. The door closed with a soft click. Sarah stayed frozen under the blanket, her lungs burning. When she finally dared to lower it, the room looked the same. Dim, still, but no longer safe. She pressed her palms to her cheeks, her skin clammy and cold. Underneath the terror, a small spark flickered to life in her chest. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "Perhaps you will be braver than I was." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. The ember inside her pulsed once, faint but unmistakable. She wasn't sure yet what she would do, but she knew now that she wasn't the first, and she would not let herself be the last. Morning came slow and heavy, like cold syrup spilling across the mountains. Sarah lay awake long before dawn, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her mind replaying every word from Margaret's hidden journal. When the first pale light filtered through the fog, she forced herself to rise. Her limbs felt hollow, each movement careful, as if the floor itself might betray her. She dressed in silence, her fingers numb and clumsy as they tied the buttons of her black dress. When she glanced at the window, she saw only a flat wall of gray, the yard beyond completely swallowed by mist. A knock, sharp and abrupt, broke the thick stillness. Agnes entered without waiting for permission. She carried a small basket of laundry and a chipped basin filled with cold water. "Wash these," Agnes said, setting the basin on the chair by the window. Her eyes flicked over Sarah's face, then dropped quickly away. Sarah nodded, lowering her gaze to the floor. Agnes hesitated at the doorway, her bony fingers twitching against the doorframe as if she might say something. But she turned and left, her steps fading down the hall. Sarah dipped her hands into the basin. The water bit at her skin like tiny needles. As she scrubbed the fabric, her mind drifted to the journal hidden beneath the floorboard. Margaret's desperate words looping over and over in her mind. "Perhaps you will be braver than I was." She looked out the window. The fog shifted and parted slightly, revealing the faint outline of the orchard fence beyond the yard. A strange tremor ran through her chest, a sudden, painful longing for open air, for movement, for a road that led anywhere but here. A sharp noise downstairs made her jump. She leaned closer to the window, straining her ears. She could just make out Thomas's low voice, measured and heavy, as if each word were a stone. Agnes's reply came as thin, nervous mutters. Then another sound, a sharp crash, followed by silence. Sarah froze. Her wet hands hovered above the basin, water dripping from her fingers. A moment later, footsteps thundered up the stairs. The door burst open so suddenly that Sarah nearly fell backward. Thomas stood there, his eyes hard and narrow. He looked at the basin, at the dripping laundry, then at Sarah. His gaze seemed to peel back her skin. "You think you can wander wherever you please?" he hissed. Sarah shook her head quickly, her lips parting, but no sound came. Thomas stepped into the room, his boots striking the floor like hammer blows. He grabbed the edge of the basin and flung it aside. Water splashed across the floor and up the walls, the basin rolling under the bed with a hollow clatter. Sarah stumbled backward, hitting the wall. Her breath came in shallow bursts. Thomas advanced on her, his hand shooting out to grab her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. His fingers dug into her skin, cold and sharp as iron nails. "You will not leave your room without permission," he snarled. You will not watch the yard. You will not look where you are not meant to look." Sarah's eyes watered, her vision a blur of gray and white. She tried to nod, but his grip only tightened. After a long, suffocating moment, he released her. She crumpled to the floor, her hands braced against the planks. Thomas stood over her, his breathing heavy. For a moment she thought he might strike her again. Instead, he turned sharply, his coat whipping around his legs. He left the room without another word, slamming the door behind him. The echo trembled through the walls like distant thunder. Sarah stayed on the floor, her chest heaving. Slowly, she lifted a trembling hand to her cheek where his fingers had pressed deep, leaving red marks that pulsed with each heartbeat. When her breathing finally slowed, she crawled to the bed and pulled herself up. Her eyes landed on the hidden floorboard. Margaret's words burned in her mind, searing through the fog of her fear. "Perhaps you will be braver than I was." Sarah pressed her forehead against the wall, her body shaking from head to toe. A sob slipped out, muffled against the wood. But beneath that sob, the ember inside her stirred again, faint but alive. In that moment, something shifted. The house felt less like an unbreakable fortress and more like a cage with weak hinges waiting to be tested. She didn't know how or when, but now she knew. She could not stay silent forever. And maybe, just maybe, she would be braver. The house fell into a heavy, watchful silence after Thomas's outburst. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed for what felt like hours, her fingers tracing the faint lines of the bruises blooming on her cheek and jaw. Outside, the fog had thickened again, wrapping the yard and orchard in a ghostly blanket. The usual creaks of the old timbers felt louder now, echoing through the hall like distant warnings. A soft knock at the door made her jump. Before she could answer, Agnes slipped in, her thin frame almost folding into the shadows. She carried a small tin cup of broth, the steam curling weakly into the cold air. Agnes set it down on the small table by the bed without meeting Sarah's eyes. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she swallowed the words, her throat working visibly. "Eat," she whispered at last, her voice nearly lost in the hush of the room. Sarah looked up, searching Agnes's lined face for some sign of warmth or pity, but the woman's eyes darted away. "Agnes!" Sarah's voice cracked from disuse and fear. "Please, help me." Agnes froze. Her hands twitched at her sides, fingers curling into claws. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes wide and bright in the half-light. "Quiet," Agnes breathed, the words sharp and urgent. She took a quick step forward and pressed a bony finger against Sarah's lips. "You mustn't ask," she hissed. "He hears. He always hears." Sarah's heart pounded. Her hands rose, catching Agnes's wrist in a trembling grip. "Please," she whispered again, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't stay. I will die here." Agnes's gaze flickered, the hard shell around her cracking for the briefest moment. Her eyes softened, her mouth trembling as though she might finally speak the truth buried beneath her silence. Then her head jerked sharply toward the door. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, heavy, measured, unmistakable. Agnes wrenched her hand free and stumbled backward. In 2 quick strides, she was at the door. She paused only long enough to look over her shoulder at Sarah, her eyes filled with a complex, terrible sorrow. Then she slipped out, closing the door with a careful click. Sarah pressed her hands to her face, her breath ragged. Every part of her body ached, her cheek, her knees, her throat tight with unshed screams. She pushed herself up and crossed the room to the small table. The broth had gone cold, a thin skin forming on its surface. She took a sip anyway, the taste flat and bitter, but she forced it down. After a few shaky gulps, she set the cup aside and moved to the window. Through the fog, she could just make out the orchard fence, the vague outline of the barn beyond it. She thought of Samuel, His hunched shoulders, his downcast eyes, the flicker of something alive that had passed between them that day in the yard. "You mustn't ask. He always hears." Agnes's words echoed through her skull like a tolling bell, but beneath them something else pulsed, deeper and sharper, the memory of Margaret's final line. "Perhaps you will be braver than I was." Sarah turned from the window, her mind whirling with fragments of warnings, glances, and silences. She dropped to her knees beside the bed and pried up the loose floorboard once more. The papers lay there, waiting like a patient heartbeat. She lifted them carefully, her fingers smudging the edges. Margaret's writing blurred as tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, but she forced herself to read. "He watches everything. He knows before you even think it. But there is a path. Through the orchard, behind the barn. If someone helps, there is a chance. I was too weak. I couldn't do it alone. I pray someone finds this and runs before he breaks them completely." Sarah's tears fell faster, dotting the brittle paper like rain on dry earth. She pressed the pages to her chest, her breath shaking. She knew now. There was a path, a chance, a thread of escape woven through all the darkness and silence. She pushed the pages back into the cavity and replaced the floorboard. When she stood, she felt dizzy, the room tilting slightly under her feet. She crossed to the window once more and pressed her palm to the cold glass. The fog moved outside like a living thing, shifting and curling, hiding and revealing pieces of the world beyond. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of acting alone sent a deep shiver through her bones. Samuel. The name repeated inside her skull like a desperate mantra. Her fingers curled into fists against the glass. Agnes's warning, Margaret's words, Samuel's frightened glances, they tangled inside her mind, pushing against the suffocating rules Thomas had laid over this house like iron bars. A single tremulous thought pushed through the tangle. Tomorrow I will try. She stepped back from the window, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the thin pulse of resolve shiver under her skin. Tomorrow! The next morning dawned pale and wet. Rain dripped from the roof in a slow, steady rhythm that filled Sarah's room like a ticking clock. She lay in bed long after the first creaks of movement echoed through the house, her eyes fixed on the gray ceiling. Her mind replayed Margaret's words over and over. There is a path, through the orchard, behind the barn. The words lit small sparks beneath her ribs, fighting against the chill of dread that weighed on her limbs. A soft knock at the door startled her. Before she could answer, Agnes slipped inside carrying a small bowl of thin porridge. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the floorboards for a moment before flicking away. "Eat," Agnes murmured, setting the bowl on the small table. Sarah pushed herself up, her joints stiff and sore. She looked at Agnes, her lips parting to speak, but Agnes shook her head sharply. "Quiet," Agnes whispered, her voice thin as paper. Her eyes darted toward the hallway again. Sarah's chest tightened. She felt the words trapped in her throat, burning behind her teeth. She watched as Agnes moved toward the door, her shoulders bent beneath an invisible weight. "Please," Sarah finally managed to whisper, her voice breaking. "Samuel, does he know the way?" Agnes froze. Her back stiffened, and for a heartbeat she didn't move at all. Then she turned her head slightly, just enough that Sarah could see the sharp edge of fear in her profile. "Quiet," Agnes breathed again, but her lips trembled. She lingered a moment longer, her fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe so tightly her knuckles whitened. Finally, without another word, she slipped out and closed the door behind her. Sarah pressed her hands to her face, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. She felt as if the walls pressed closer around her, the air heavy and sour. She forced herself to eat a few spoonfuls of the cold porridge, each bite turning to paste in her mouth. Then she set the bowl aside and crossed to the window. The rain had turned the yard into a mess of mud and standing water. The orchard beyond looked like a gray smear, the trees half hidden in the morning mist. Movement near the barn caught her eye. Samuel. He moved slowly, dragging a sack of feed toward the open barn door. Even from her window she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his head jerked up at every small sound. She pressed her forehead to the glass, her pulse hammering in her ears. Without thinking, she raised her hand and tapped lightly on the window pane. Samuel paused. He turned his head slowly, his eyes lifting toward the house. For a moment they locked on hers, wide, startled, and full of unspoken words. Sarah flattened her hand against the glass. Her lips moved soundlessly. "Help me." Samuel's eyes widened further. His mouth opened as if to respond, but then he snapped his head toward the barn door. A shadow passed across the yard, Thomas stepping out from the side of the house, his dark coat blending into the rain-soaked walls. Samuel dropped his gaze immediately and hauled the sack inside, disappearing into the barn's darkness. Thomas paused in the yard, scanning the house with slow, deliberate movements. His eyes landed on Sarah's window. Sarah flinched and dropped to the floor beneath the window ledge, her breath caught painfully in her chest. She pressed her palms flat against the boards, counting the seconds until her heartbeat slowed. She dared not look again. Minutes passed like hours. When she finally crept back up to the window, the yard was empty. The rain had eased into a cold drizzle, the trees dripping quietly. She slid to the floor again, her back against the wall, her head tipped back as she stared at the ceiling. Samuel had seen her. He had heard her. The thought sparked something fierce and trembling in her chest. She didn't know if he would help, if he even could. But that moment, that single shared look, was enough to keep the ember inside her burning. She pressed her fingers to her lips as if trying to hold the silent plea inside. Tonight, she thought, or tomorrow, soon. She tilted her head to listen. Downstairs, she heard Thomas's boots move across the floor, slow and heavy, echoing through the walls like a heartbeat she couldn't escape. She curled into herself, wrapping her arms around her knees. The cold crept into her bones, but she held on to the small flicker of defiance Samuel had given her. Outside, the rain began again, a steady whisper against the roof that sounded almost like a voice urging her forward. Night fell like a heavy curtain, swallowing the last pale light and pressing against the windows in thick, suffocating waves. The house creaked and shifted in the dark, each groan of the timbers echoing in Sarah's skull like a warning. She sat on her bed, her arms wrapped around her knees, listening. Somewhere below, Thomas moved through the rooms with his usual deliberate steps, each one measured and heavy. At some point, the sounds ceased. The silence that followed felt even louder, a deep, watchful hush that settled into her bones. She stood, her legs trembling so badly she had to brace herself against the wall. The fog outside had thickened again, turning the orchard and the yard into a solid wall of gray. She crossed to the window and pressed her forehead to the cold glass. The moon glowed faintly above the clouds, its light broken into shards by drifting mist. Suddenly, a flicker of movement in the yard below, a shadow moving cautiously along the side of the barn. She squinted, her breath fogging the glass. Samuel. Her pulse slammed into her throat. She pressed her hand flat against the window. Down below, he paused, looking up as if he could sense her watching. He raised his hand slowly, fingers splayed. A silent signal. Sarah's breath hitched. Her mind reeled. Was it tonight? Was this the moment? A sharp knock at her door shattered her focus. She spun around, her heart seizing. The door swung open before she could move. Thomas stood there, a lantern in his hand, casting a harsh, swinging glow across the room. His eyes swept over her, lingering on her pale face and the trembling fingers clutching her skirt. "Downstairs," he ordered. She hesitated. For a moment she thought of the journal, the floorboard, Samuel waiting outside. But Thomas's eyes darkened, and a small, cruel smile touched his lips. "Now," he snapped. Sarah forced her legs to move, each step a silent scream inside her skull. She passed him in the doorway, feeling the heat of the lantern brush against her arm. He followed close behind, so near she could hear the quiet rasp of his breath. Downstairs, the kitchen was cold and dark, except for the lantern's swaying light. Agnes stood by the far wall, her head bowed, hands twisted together at her waist. Thomas gestured to a chair at the center of the room. "Sit." Sarah obeyed, lowering herself onto the hard wooden seat. Her knees touched each other so tightly they ached. Thomas set the lantern on the table and stepped back, studying her in silence. His eyes glinted with something close to satisfaction. "You've been curious," he said after a moment, his voice low and measured, "watching, asking questions." Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came. He leaned closer, his face so near she could see every line, every small scar. "There are consequences for disobedience," he whispered. Agnes let out a small, strangled sound from the corner, but Thomas didn't turn. His hand shot out, gripping Sarah's wrist so tightly she felt her bones grind together. "You belong to this house now," he hissed. "You belong to me." Sarah's mind screamed, but her body stayed frozen, her breath shallow and fast. Thomas released her wrist abruptly, the sudden absence of his grip leaving her skin burning. He stepped back, picked up the lantern, and turned to Agnes. "Take her to the cellar," he ordered. Agnes's eyes widened, her lips parting as if to protest, but no sound came. She shuffled forward, her face pale as wax. Thomas shoved the lantern into her hands. "Now!" Agnes flinched, then turned to Sarah. Her eyes glistened with something like pity, or fear too deep to name. "Come," she croaked, barely audible. Sarah stood on shaking legs. She felt the weight of Thomas's stare on her back as Agnes led her down the narrow hallway toward the cellar door. The door creaked open, releasing a sharp, earthy smell. The stairs beyond vanished into thick darkness. Agnes held the lantern high, her hand shaking so badly the light jumped across the walls. Sarah stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned under her foot, each step echoing like a drumbeat of finality. When they reached the bottom, Agnes set the lantern on a crate. She turned to Sarah, her lips trembling. "Forgive me," she whispered, so softly it felt like a breath. Then she backed away and climbed the stairs, leaving Sarah alone in the dark. The door closed with a heavy thud, and the lock clicked into place. Sarah stood still, her breath ragged, her eyes wide in the small pool of lantern light. Around her, the cellar walls pressed close, lined with old barrels and broken crates. The damp earth beneath her feet felt like ice. She looked at the lantern, the small flame flickering wildly. Above her, she heard Thomas's footsteps fade away, then silence. Sarah pressed a hand to her chest, her fingers curling over the thudding heartbeat that pulsed with something more than fear. It was rage. It was a promise. The cellar felt alive in the dark, each tiny creak and shifting echo like a whisper against Sarah's ears. She stood in the flickering lantern light, her breath shallow, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve until the fabric nearly tore. She turned in slow circles, her eyes scanning the stacked barrels and rotting crates. The air was damp and heavy, smelling of earth and old mold. The walls seemed to lean inward, pressing her closer to the narrow center of the room. She spotted an old stool near the far wall and sat, her legs shaking so badly she nearly collapsed onto it. The lantern's glow quivered, casting tall, thin shadows that crawled up the walls like silent watchers. Sarah pressed her palms together, her mind churning. "There is a path through the orchard, behind the barn." Margaret's words beat against her skull like a drum. She remembered Samuel's eyes that afternoon, the silent plea and the signal in the yard. He had seen her. He knew. But now she was here, locked below the ground like a broken doll, her escape pushed further away than ever. She drew in a slow breath and forced herself to stand again. Her fingers skimmed along the rough stone walls, searching for any crack, any weakness. When her hand brushed across a small groove in the mortar, she paused, leaning closer. A faint draft slipped through the narrow opening. Her heart surged, a painful, blinding rush of hope. She dropped to her knees, clawing at the groove with shaking fingers. Bits of crumbling mortar fell under her nails. She pressed her face close, trying to see into the darkness beyond. Nothing but blackness met her, but the air smelled fresher than the rest of the cellar. A promise of the world beyond these walls. She heard a noise above her. The floorboards creaked sharply. She froze, her ear tilted upward. Then silence. She leaned back against the wall, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Her hands throbbed from clawing at the stone, blood seeping from tiny cuts beneath her nails. The lantern guttered, the flame shrinking low. She staggered to it, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the wick. The small light steadied, but its warmth felt pitiful against the cold that seeped into her bones. She lowered herself to the ground and pulled her knees to her chest. Her mind drifted to Agnes. The old woman's face haunted her. That final look before she left Sarah in the dark. A flicker of regret, maybe even a dying ember of compassion. And Samuel, his slumped shoulders, his quick glances, the silent language they shared across the yard. Sarah shut her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slowly, deeply. "Perhaps you will be braver than I was." Margaret's voice echoed in her mind, weaving itself around her fear like a thin thread of steel. Sarah's fists tightened in her skirt. She would not die in this cellar. She would not vanish into the cold ground beneath Thomas's boots. Her mind reached forward, feeling for Samuel across the dark, as if he might somehow hear her thoughts. She pictured him outside, perhaps waiting by the barn, watching the orchard fence. A sudden noise snapped her eyes open. The lock above turned slowly, metal scraping against metal. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her hands darting for anything she could use. A shard of broken crate, a loose stone, but there was nothing. The door swung open, and Agnes stood at the top of the stairs. The lantern she held shook in her hands, casting wild shadows down the steps. Her eyes darted over Sarah, wide and terrified. "Quick!" Agnes rasped. "Before he returns." Sarah's legs nearly gave way. She stumbled forward, her feet catching on the uneven ground. Agnes reached out and grabbed her arm, her grip surprisingly strong for such frail fingers. They climbed the steps together, each movement sharp with terror. At the top, Agnes paused, her breath coming in fast, thin gasps. "Samuel waits," she whispered. "Go." Sarah tried to speak, to thank her, but no words came. Agnes pushed her toward the hallway. "Go!" Sarah ran, her steps light and silent on the wooden floor. She slipped through the side door into the icy night air. The fog hugged her immediately, swallowing her whole. Her breath burst from her lips in white clouds, her lungs burning. Ahead, near the edge of the orchard, a figure moved. Samuel. Their eyes met, wide and electric, with shared fear and wild hope. Samuel gestured frantically toward the fence, his hands slicing the fog like blades. Sarah ran to him, her feet slipping in the wet grass. When she reached him, he caught her arm, steadying her. "This way," he mouthed, his voice lost to the night. Sarah nodded, her tears mixing with the fog on her face. Together they turned toward the fence, the path beyond hidden but real, and waiting. Samuel led her through the orchard, their feet sinking into the wet earth, the fog curling around their legs like cold fingers. Sarah stumbled once, catching herself on a low branch, but Samuel pulled her forward, his grip firm and urgent. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted limbs dripping with rain. Each step felt impossibly loud in the hush of the night, each breath a fragile thread that might snap at any moment. When they reached the far edge of the orchard, Samuel paused. His chest heaved with silent gasps, his eyes darting back toward the house. Sarah turned, her heart pounding against her ribs so hard she thought it might split her apart. The house loomed through the fog, a dark shape against the moonlit sky. No lights burned in the windows, but she felt Thomas's presence, as if he might step from the shadows at any second. Samuel tugged her arm, drawing her attention back. He pointed toward a narrow break in the old fence, 2 slats broken and pushed aside just enough for a person to slip through. She moved toward it, her fingers trembling as she brushed over the splintered wood. Beyond, the ground fell away into a narrow, hidden trail that disappeared into a deep hollow of trees and rocks. Samuel touched her shoulder. When she turned, he looked into her eyes, his face pale and raw with fear. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he forced the words out in a low, rasping whisper. "Go, now." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. She glanced back once more at the house. "What about you?" she whispered. Samuel shook his head fiercely. "Go," he repeated. "He will come. You must not wait." Tears blurred her vision, but she forced herself to nod. She stepped toward the fence, ducking low. The broken boards scraped her shoulders, snagging on her dress, but she pushed through, dropping onto the trail beyond. She looked back one last time. Samuel stood at the fence, his silhouette small and shaking. Their eyes locked, a final silent exchange that said more than any words could hold. Then he turned, melting back into the orchard, his body swallowed by fog. Sarah pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the frantic pulse beneath her skin. She turned to face the trail and began to move, her steps small and unsteady at first. The path sloped downward sharply, winding between rocks slick with moss and roots that snaked across the mud like traps. Her dress tore as she slipped and caught herself against the stones, but she kept going, her breath tearing out in ragged bursts. The forest pressed close on all sides, a living wall that seemed to watch her, listen to her every movement. She felt the cold bite into her bones, her fingers numb and clumsy as she grabbed at branches to steady herself. Behind her a sharp sound sliced through the fog, a shout, harsh and furious. "Thomas!" Panic flooded her veins, driving her legs faster. She crashed through a low tangle of underbrush, her hands bleeding from thorns and jagged bark. Her lungs burned, each inhale a sharp stab. She reached a small clearing where the moonlight fell in a thin, ghostly sheet. She paused, bent double, clutching her knees. The world spun around her, the trees swaying like black waves. Then another shout, closer now. The crack of a branch under a heavy boot. She lurched forward again, her vision narrowing to a single desperate point. Forward. Away. Roots caught her ankles, rocks tore at her shins, but she did not stop. The trail curved sharply, revealing a narrow ravine, its bottom lost in darkness. A crude wooden bridge stretched across, sagging under the weight of years and neglect. She hesitated only a heartbeat before charging forward. The boards creaked and shifted under her feet, but she kept her eyes fixed on the far side. Halfway across, she heard it. Thomas's voice, ragged and inhuman with rage. "Sarah!" The sound slammed into her back like a fist. She stumbled, her hand grasping a rotten railing that gave way beneath her grip. She nearly fell, her foot slipping between the boards, but she yanked herself upright and pushed on. At the far end, she hurled herself off the bridge, collapsing onto the muddy ground. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her body a raw, shaking instrument of terror and determination. The trail narrowed again, curving between two large boulders, slick with rain. She pressed her back to the stone, her breath catching in sharp gasps. For a moment all was silent except the distant rush of blood in her ears. Then a faint rustle behind her. Thomas was on the bridge. Sarah pushed away from the rock and ran again, each step driven by a single pulsing word in her mind: survive. Sarah ran, her feet barely finding purchase on the slick earth. Each step sent shock waves through her bruised legs, but she didn't slow down. Her breath tore out in ragged bursts that burned her throat. The forest thickened ahead, a dark wall of twisted trunks and wet undergrowth. Branches clawed at her dress, tore at her hair, left shallow scratches across her arms and neck. Behind her the sound of pursuit grew louder. Thomas's crashing steps, the snap of branches under his boots, and above it all, his voice, raw and furious. "Sarah, you can't run from me." She stumbled, catching herself against a tree. Her fingers dug into the bark, her nails splitting. She forced herself upright and pushed forward again, her mind focused on a single idea. Forward. Just forward. She broke through a dense patch of brambles and nearly fell into a shallow stream. The cold water rushed around her ankles, biting into her skin. She gasped, hesitated for a second, then splashed across, her dress dragging in the current. On the far side, she crawled up a steep bank, clawing at moss and roots. Her muscles screamed, her chest felt like it might burst. At the top, she collapsed onto the muddy ground. For a moment she lay still, her ears filled with the pounding of her pulse. Then she heard it, the sound of water splashing. Thomas was crossing the stream. Panic surged up, choking her. She scrambled to her knees and forced her body forward, staggering deeper into the woods. The moonlight slipped through the branches in pale slashes, guiding her steps like faint lanterns in a fog. She rounded a bend and saw an old wooden fence ahead, half fallen, covered in moss. Beyond it, the trees thinned slightly, revealing an overgrown trail that curved downward, disappearing into deeper shadows. Sarah threw herself over the fence, the rotting wood splintering under her weight. She fell hard on the other side, her elbow slamming into a rock. Pain shot up her arm, but she ignored it. She crawled forward, dragging herself into the underbrush. Her breath came in quiet, broken sobs. Behind her, Thomas crashed through the fence. She heard him curse, his voice strangled with rage. "Sarah!" His steps slowed, and she imagined him scanning the clearing, peering into the tangled growth where she hid. Sarah pressed herself against the earth, her cheek resting in wet leaves. She clamped her hand over her mouth, forcing her breath to stay silent, though her lungs screamed for air. A long moment stretched on. Then, footsteps, close. The scrape of boots moving carefully over the forest floor. She felt his presence pass just feet from where she lay. His breathing was ragged, animal-like, as he pushed aside branches, searching. "Come back!" he snarled into the darkness. "It doesn't have to be this way." Sarah's body trembled, her nails digging into the mud. She thought of Margaret's journal, of Agnes's haunted eyes, of Samuel's hand pushing her toward the fence. She thought of the heavy silence of the house, the cellar's cold walls. "No," she whispered to herself, so softly it barely formed a sound. Thomas paused. His head snapped in her direction. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. She felt her entire body tense, ready to spring. Then a sudden noise, a branch cracking deeper in the woods. Thomas turned sharply toward it, his steps crashing away into the darkness. She waited, barely breathing, until his sounds faded. The forest swallowed him like a deep sea. Slowly, painfully, She pushed herself up. Every part of her body protested. Her head spun, black spots swimming in her vision. She forced her feet under her, wobbling unsteadily. Ahead, the faint trail still curved down and away. She stumbled forward, each step an act of sheer will. Her hand pressed against her side where a deep bruise throbbed with each movement. Above her, the moon peeked through a break in the clouds, lighting the trail in a cold, silvery glow. She didn't know where it led. She didn't know if she would make it beyond the next bend. But she knew she could not go back. She glanced over her shoulder once, her eyes searching the shadows for any sign of Thomas. Nothing. She turned forward again, her breath a shaky promise in the cold air. Keep going. Sarah moved like a phantom through the trees, her body half bent, her hands pushing aside branches that grabbed at her like bony fingers. The moon vanished behind a thick veil of clouds, plunging the forest into a deeper darkness. Her feet slipped on the wet leaves, her dress snagged and tore, but she pressed forward. Each step felt like stepping off a ledge into blackness, but she kept going. She didn't know how long she had been running, minutes or hours. Time had dissolved into the frantic rhythm of her heartbeat, the rush of blood in her ears. A sudden sound behind her made her freeze. She turned her head, her breath caught high in her throat. Silence. Then the wind shifted, carrying the distant echo of a voice. "Sarah!" Thomas's voice, low and sharp, threading through the trees like a poisoned arrow. She shivered, hugging her arms around her ribs. She scanned the forest ahead, her eyes straining for any sign of a path or a break in the endless wall of black trunks. She stumbled forward again, half running, half falling. Her knees buckled every few steps, her palms raw from catching herself on rocks and roots. Finally, through the fog and the shifting shadows, she saw a shape, a low stone wall, half collapsed and covered in ivy. Beyond it, a narrow path wound upward, disappearing into the slope. She scrambled toward it, her fingers scraping over the cold, wet stones as she climbed over. On the other side, she fell to her knees, gasping. The ground here felt firmer, the air somehow different, thinner, drier, as though she had climbed above the worst of the fog. She forced herself up and looked back. Nothing moved in the trees behind her. No crashing steps, no wild curses. She pressed her hand against her chest, her heart pounding so violently she felt sick. Ahead, the path climbed steeply, framed by ancient oaks whose branches arched overhead like ribs. The moon slipped free of the clouds for a moment, silvering the trail and lighting her way. She moved again, this time slower, every sense straining. Her ears twitched at every groan of the trees, every shift of the wind. As she climbed, the path curved sharply and opened onto a small clearing. In the center stood an old wooden structure, barely more than a shed, its roof caved in on one side, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. She staggered forward, drawn to it by some instinct deeper than reason. When she reached the door, she pushed it open slowly, the hinges wailing in protest. Inside, the darkness swallowed her. She waited, her breath echoing against the damp walls. Gradually, her eyes adjusted. A narrow bench ran along one side. A pile of brittle straw filled the corner. Broken tools and rotting planks lay scattered on the dirt floor. She stepped inside and shut the door as quietly as she could, pressing her back against it. The sudden stillness pressed around her, a heavy silence that wrapped her tight. She slid down to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. Her whole body trembled, every muscle spent and burning. In the hush, Her mind slowly crawled back to her. She thought of the journal under the floorboard, of Agnes's desperate whisper, of Samuel's eyes. She imagined him now, standing alone in the orchard, facing Thomas's wrath. The thought sliced into her chest, sharp and deep. Tears welled and spilled, hot against her cold skin. She buried her face in her arms, her sobs muffled by the folds of her dress. Above her the wind rattled the broken roof. A drip of rain slipped through, splashing onto the dirt beside her. In that moment, she felt the weight of everything she had lost. Her home, her safety, her very name whispered away in the dark halls of that house. But under the grief, a small, stubborn heat remained. She had run. She had chosen the black, freezing forest over his voice, his hand, his rules. She pressed her forehead to her knees, her breath slowing. She didn't know what waited beyond this night. The path might end in another trap, another cage. But she had broken the first chain. Outside, the forest shifted and moaned, but she stayed still, folded tight around the tiny flame she refused to let die. Sarah woke to the pale gray wash of dawn leaking through the broken boards above her. Her limbs felt heavy, every joint stiff and raw from the cold. She shifted slowly, each small movement scraping pain across her body. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Only the deep ache in her bones and the sour taste of fear on her tongue. Then it came rushing back. The orchard, the fence, the chase through the forest, Thomas's voice tearing through the dark. She pressed her palm against the dirt floor and pushed herself upright, her head spinning. She sat still, waiting for the dizziness to pass, her breath coiling into small clouds in the icy air. Outside, the forest lay hushed and brittle in the early light. Fog still clung low among the trunks, but the first hints of blue sky glimmered far above. Sarah crawled to the doorway and peered out. The trail beyond the clearing looked clearer now, winding uphill before disappearing around a bend. She listened, her ears straining. No footsteps, no crashing underbrush, only the slow drip of melting frost and the sigh of wind through dead leaves. Her thoughts turned to Samuel. The memory of his frightened eyes, his final push toward freedom, hit her like a blow to the chest. She clutched the doorway, her fingers digging into the splintered wood. She didn't know what had happened to him, if he had escaped, if he had paid the price for her flight. The not knowing twisted inside her like a blade. She forced herself to stand. Her legs shook, but they held. She stepped carefully from the shack, her feet sinking into the wet leaves. The cold bit at her skin, but she embraced it. Each sharp sting reminded her she was alive, that she had chosen this pain over the silent death waiting in Thomas's house. She limped up the trail, her steps cautious and slow. Every few paces she paused to listen, her heart thudding in her ears. As she climbed, the trees began to thin. Shafts of pale sunlight slanted through the branches, catching on patches of moss and frost like small lanterns. At the top of the slope, she stopped. Before her, the land fell away into a wide, misty valley. From this height, she could see scattered pines below, patches of brown fields, and far beyond, a thin, wavering line of smoke rising into the sky, a sign of life. She staggered forward, her breath catching in her throat. The sight pulled a sob from deep in her chest, a sound part joy and part despair. But before she could move further, a sudden noise behind her snapped her around. Thomas! He stood at the edge of the trees, his dark coat torn and mud-splattered, his hair wild around his face, his eyes locked on her, burning with a feral light. "Sarah!" he roared, his voice ragged, half-mad. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on a root. She barely caught herself from falling over the ridge. Thomas lunged forward, crashing through the underbrush, his hands outstretched. Sarah turned and bolted along the ridgeline. Her feet slipped on the slick moss, her hands clawing at low branches for balance. He was close, She could hear his breaths, hoarse and vicious, just behind her. A sudden drop opened to her right, a narrow, rocky slope leading down into a lower clearing. Without thinking, she flung herself down, rolling and sliding over stones and mud. Pain flared through her side and across her back. She tumbled to the bottom and landed hard, gasping. She forced herself up, the world spinning. She staggered forward into the open clearing, her eyes blurring with tears. Thomas slid down after her, landing heavily. He pushed to his feet with a snarl, his eyes fixed on her. "You think you can run?" he spat. "You think you can leave me?" Sarah's legs buckled, but she caught herself, her hands balling into fists. He advanced step by step, his boots crushing the frosty grass. In that moment, something inside her snapped. She straightened, her shoulders squaring, her eyes locked on his, clear and cold. "I am not yours," she said, her voice low but steady. Thomas paused, his face contorting with shock and rage. Then he lunged. Sarah darted sideways. He grabbed her sleeve, tearing the fabric, but she twisted free. She seized a fallen branch from the ground and swung it blindly. The branch cracked across his face. Thomas reeled back, his hand flying to his cheek, a snarl ripping from his throat. Sarah dropped the branch and ran, her lungs screaming, her feet pounding toward the edge of the clearing. Behind her, Thomas roared and crashed after her. The forest seemed to close around them, branches whipping past in a blur of gray and green. Sarah didn't look back. "Run!" Sarah burst through the far side of the clearing, her breath tearing from her lungs in sharp, wet gasps. Her feet slipped and slid across the muddy slope as she fought to stay upright. Behind her, Thomas crashed through the undergrowth, his curses ragged and animal-like, echoing off the trees. She scrambled up a small incline, grabbing at roots and stones to pull herself higher. Her hands bled where bark and sharp rock tore into them, but she hardly felt the pain. All she could think was forward, forward, forward. Reaching the top, she stumbled onto a narrow ledge overlooking a sharp drop. The valley below opened wide, the fog lifting just enough to reveal fields and a distant path winding toward something. A village, a farm, salvation. She turned to see Thomas heaving himself up behind her, his face flushed, his hair stuck to his forehead with sweat and dirt. His eyes locked onto her with a feverish, possessive glow. "You belong to me," he howled, his voice so hoarse it cracked into a growl. Sarah backed up to the very edge, her boots skidding on loose stones. The cold wind whipped around her, tugging at her torn dress and tangled hair. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, but her eyes stayed fixed on him, no longer pleading, no longer afraid. Thomas stepped forward, his hands clawing at the air, as if he could pull her back by force of will alone. "Come here," he barked. "You think you can leave? You think you can exist without me?" Sarah shook her head slowly. Her voice came out low and firm, surprising even her. "I am not yours. I was never yours." His face twisted, all reason dissolving into pure, seething rage. With a snarl, he lunged at her. She dodged sideways at the last moment. His momentum carried him past her, his arms flailing as he stumbled on the slick edge. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. In his, she saw shock, terror, and something else. The hollow truth of a man who had built his power on fear and silence. Then Thomas's foot slipped. He let out a strangled cry as he pitched forward over the edge. His hands clawed at empty air before his body vanished from sight. A heavy, final thud echoed up from below, followed by a suffocating silence. Sarah stood frozen, her body swaying dangerously close to the cliff edge. Her breath came in wild, uneven waves, each inhale laced with disbelief and relief, so sharp it felt like a wound. Slowly, she staggered backward, collapsing to her knees a few feet from the edge. Her fingers dug into the earth, grounding her, anchoring her to this moment. The wind howled around her. carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. She lifted her head, her eyes drifting across the valley below. The pale light of dawn crept over the fields, soft and hesitant. In the distance she could see the faint shape of rooftops and smoke curling into the sky, signs of life, of people, of a future beyond this nightmare. Tears blurred her vision. She pressed her forehead to the ground, her whole body shaking, not just with exhaustion, but with the sudden crushing release of terror that had lived in her bones for too long. She lay there for what felt like hours, letting the cold seep into her skin, feeling every bruise, every cut, every ragged breath. Then, finally, she pushed herself upright. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but they held. She turned to look at the valley one more time. Go, she thought. She took a shaky step forward, then another, the promise of the distant rooftops pulling her onward like a fragile thread. Every step felt like shedding a skin, the Sarah who obeyed, who trembled under whispered threats, who belonged to anyone but herself. She did not know what she would find at the end of this path. Safety, suspicion, perhaps another kind of struggle. But she would meet it standing. Sarah moved slowly down the slope, each step deliberate, every breath a cautious victory. The morning light spread further across the valley, revealing patches of frost-covered grass and thin ribbons of smoke curling from distant chimneys. Her dress clung to her legs, heavy with mud and blood. Her hair hung in wild, damp tangles down her back. Her hands throbbed with raw pain, each cut and bruise a burning reminder of the night before. But she kept going. A small, crooked path emerged from the trees, leading down into a hollow. Birds called above her, their fragile songs stitching the pale sky back together. She paused to listen, her chest tightening at the simple, bright sound. At the bottom of the hollow she found a narrow footbridge spanning a shallow, icy stream. The boards creaked under her weight, but she crossed without looking down, her eyes fixed on the far bank, on the thin dirt track winding away toward the valley floor. When she reached the other side, she fell to her knees. Her body trembled with exhaustion and cold, but she did not collapse. She pressed her palms into the damp earth, grounding herself again and again. Memories surged up. Thomas's hands gripping her, Agnes's trembling voice, Samuel's eyes lit with terrified hope. She whispered their names into the morning air, each one a soft exhale of grief and gratitude. Agnes, Samuel, Margaret. They had each been a small, flickering light inside that dark house. They had each helped her in tiny, dangerous ways. And now she carried them with her. She stood again, her knees locking painfully. The trail rose gently from the hollow, curving toward a ridge. Beyond that, she could see the edge of fields and the distant shapes of rooftops, life, unknown and waiting. As she climbed, her breath slowed, the fog in her mind clearing little by little. She could almost imagine her feet stepping into a small village square, her eyes meeting strangers' faces, her voice, long silent, finally speaking her name aloud again. Her name. Sarah stopped. She turned her face up to the pale sky, letting the thin winter sun warm her cheeks. Her lips parted, shaping the word she had almost forgotten. Sarah. The sound broke into the air like a bell. Weak, cracked, but hers. Tears slid down her cheeks, catching on her cracked lips. She smiled through them, a tremulous, fierce curve that felt foreign on her face. She took another step, then another. With every movement she felt the weight of Thomas's hands slip further away, the echo of his voice fade into the forest behind her. Ahead she saw a figure emerge on the trail, a man leading a donkey loaded with sacks. He stopped when he saw her, his face turning from curiosity to alarm as he took in her torn dress, her wild hair, her bleeding hands. He called something, words she couldn't make out, but his voice was gentle, human. Sarah tried to answer, but her throat caught. She raised a hand instead, a small pleading gesture. The man dropped the donkey's reins and ran toward her. As he drew closer, Sarah's legs finally buckled. She fell forward, and strong arms caught her, lowering her gently to the ground. "You're safe now," he said, though she barely heard him. His words washed over her like warm water. She closed her eyes, her body folding into the ground, the last shivers of terror draining from her muscles. The man's hands hovered above her face, uncertain, careful. She felt the warmth of his coat, the steady beat of his heart close to her ear. Somewhere deep inside, the ember she had carried all this way flared into a fragile new warmth. Not yet a flame, not yet whole, but alive. Sarah forced her eyes open once more, meeting the man's gaze. "Help," she managed to whisper. Her voice was a ragged thread, but it carried everything, her past, her fight, her plea. The man nodded quickly, his own eyes shining with shock and relief. "I will," he said. "I promise." Sarah exhaled, a long, trembling breath that seemed to empty every dark corner inside her. She closed her eyes again, the weight of the forest lifting at last, and for the first time in what felt like centuries, she allowed herself to believe that there was a road beyond this, a life beyond the cage, a name beyond the whispered threats, a chance to begin,